in the waiting room.
Cool. Well, thank you very much. Also, dear attenders of this talk, live attenders, we weren't expecting this and we're very happy. And without much ado, I'm not Radovan Vadovic, the chair. I'm Wendy Schneedler. I have had to take over because he had sudden COVID-related childcare duties to do. And I pass over to Andrea for the first talk.
Great. Thank you very much. So my name is Andrea Rabet. I'm an associate professor at Middlebury College in Vermont. And today I'm going to be talking about a project with my colleague Peter Matthews looking at expressive voting among American political partisans. So essentially we're interested in the extent to which people vote for what they actually believe is best or correct, or if they assume that their vote is not going to matter too much, and so they vote primarily as a means of expressing themselves or affirming their partisan identity. And in the paper that I'm going to be talking about today, we look at whether this expression is influenced by the partisan composition of their group and audience effects. So specifically, are voters more expressive when they know that they are in the majority and that there are more like-minded people who will hear them? So there have been some fairly surprising election results over the last several years, but the situation that I think best captures this idea of expression was the British vote to exit the EU in 2016. So what was particularly remarkable about the Brexit vote was that many of the people who seemed most distraught upon learning the outcome were Leave voters themselves, so the supposed winners. So for instance, the morning after the vote, BBC viewers met this guy, Adam from Manchester, who had voted Leave because he didn't think his vote was going to matter too much because he thought they were just going to remain. But upon learning otherwise, he expressed shock and worry. And Adam wasn't alone here. So social media outlets quickly filled up with stories of regretful Leave voters who would change their mind and vote differently that very afternoon. And subsequent polls would suggest that the Leave voters who regretted their choice was similar to the ultimate margin of victory, and those with the greatest regrets had assumed that Brexit was unlikely. So this suggests that if British voters had treated their vote as if they would be decisive, then Britain's future might be quite different. However, when viewed through the lens of rational choice theory, it was perfectly rational, potentially, for Adam and others to vote Leave in order to express their displeasure with the EU, even if they didn't actually want to exit. So this behavior is completely consistent with long-standing theories in public choice about how and why people vote when they're unlikely to be pivotal in deciding the outcome. So very basically, voters weigh several considerations when making a decision. On the one hand, there is the expected effect of their vote on the outcome. On the other, there are more direct benefits of casting a vote, which have nothing to do with the outcome or their ability to influence it. So feeling like they've done their civic duty, expressing a certain preference or opinion, or affirming their partisan identity. So when voters believe that they're unlikely to make a difference, concerns about influencing the outcome are muted, and these more expressive considerations take priority, a phenomenon known as expressive voting. So to illustrate this, Brennan and Buchanan famously compared the act of voting to cheering on a favorite sports team. So in most cases, you don't actually think you're going to influence the outcome by going to a game or screaming at the referees on your television, but you do it because it brings you joy and it helps you feel connected to something. So evidence of this sort of partisan cheerleading can be seen in unincentivized surveys. So political scientists have long noted that Democrats and Republicans disagree not just on policy opinions, but when it comes to basic facts. So for instance, these data are from the 1988 ANES survey, which asked respondents how unemployment and inflation had changed over the course of the Reagan administration. So while, for instance, among strong Democrats, about 30% said that unemployment had gotten better, around 85% of strong Republicans said the same thing. But is this due to genuine differences in beliefs, or is it because people prefer to answer these questions in a way that's more favorable to their own party? So important recent work finds that this is at least partially due to expression. So experiments have found that this partisan gap shrinks if you offer small financial rewards for giving the correct answer, incentivize people to admit when they don't know, or even just say, hey, you know, there are actually right and wrong answers to these questions, and we'd really prefer that you give the right one. All of these cause the partisan gap to shrink. So on the one hand, this is good news. It's encouraging that as soon as partisans are incentivized, they move toward agreement, at least on basic facts. But what about when people vote? So in this case, they're not incentivized, at least not in the same way that a decisive individual is. And so in a paper from a couple of years ago, we considered whether this partisan expression is primarily the domain of unincentivized surveys, or whether it is also an important motivator of voter behavior. So do people vote expressively by giving more partisan answers when voting than they otherwise would if they were decisive individuals? So to address this, we had political partisans answering factual questions about politics, either just for themselves or by voting in a group of varying size. In this paper, we also had other treatments which addressed separate research questions that are less relevant to the experiment that I'm going to talk about today. But this experiment was really motivated by our findings here. So I'm just going to spend a couple of minutes talking about what we did in this paper. So we had American political partisans who we recruited on Amazon Mechanical Turk in the spring of 2016. And they were asked to answer 6 factual questions about politics. These were multiple choice, and each had an objectively true answer, at least within some range that was contained in one of our multiple choice options. So for instance, when asking about climate change, we asked how much higher the mean global temperature was the previous year relative to the 20th century average. And when we asked about immigration, we asked how the number of unauthorized immigrants living in the United States had changed over the course of the Obama administration. So participants were told either that they were answering the questions only for themselves, so they were in a group of size 1, or they were matched into a group with 4 other or 24 other participants. Then for each question that the majority of the group answered correctly, all group members received a cash prize of $1. So if you're in a group by yourself, your answer always determines whether you get the bonus. If you are voting in a group, then your answer determines the outcome, whether you get the bonus or not, only if exactly half of the other group members answered correctly and half were incorrect. Participants had 30 seconds to answer each question, which were not easily Googleable, and there was no feedback in between the questions. So in this experiment, we find evidence of significant partisan expressive voting. So specifically, we found a substantial gap in the responses provided by Democrats and Republicans, and this gap was significantly smaller when people answered as individuals. So to calculate the partisan gap, we followed the same procedure as Bullock et al. 2015, which we'll also use in the current paper that I'm presenting. And we rescaled participants' responses onto the 0-1 interval, where 0 indicated the multiple choice option that was most favorable to Republicans, and 1 indicated the option most favorable to Democrats. Then we looked at the difference in the responses provided by Democrats and Republicans. So if Democrats and Republicans provide the same responses on average, then this gap would be 0. A positive number here would indicate that partisans provide responses more favorable to their own party. So what do we find? We find that both of the voting groups exhibited a clear partisan gap in responses, and there was little difference across group sizes. Now, this in itself isn't evidence of expressive voting, so Democrats and Republicans may simply have different beliefs. To address this, we need to see whether this gap shrinks when participants are answering as individuals, where their own response is sure to count. So in this case, the gap is significantly smaller. It's less than 40% of what it was when people vote. We therefore concluded that voters provide significantly more partisan responses in line with this expressive voting prediction. So now we know partisans vote expressively in this context. They cast votes that are more partisan than what they actually believe. Now that we know this, our question is, does this expression vary with the partisan composition of the group? So are people equally expressive across the board, no matter who is in their group? Or perhaps do they find the need to be more expressive when they're in the minority, like Republicans here in Vermont with their massive Trump signs, but they tone it down when they know that they're in the majority? Or are people even more expressive when they know that they're in a group of like-minded peers? So why might political expression vary with the partisan composition of the group? So there are 3 broad channels through which the composition might influence behavior. So first of all, players may react to the number of Democrats and Republicans who are voting in the game. So following the logic of the pivotal voter model, we would expect voters to be more expressive when they anticipate that they are unlikely to be pivotal. So depending on their beliefs about the likelihood that Democrats versus Republicans would be able and willing to arrive at the correct answer, the composition could affect how likely they think they are to be pivotal in determining whether they get the bonus. Second, we could think of the choice to be expressive as a sort of social dilemma. So by giving an answer that you know to be wrong but supportive of your own party, you receive a direct consumption benefit, but potentially impose an externality on the group by decreasing the likelihood that the group is right. And there's evidence from dictator games that people are more generous to members of their own party. So to the extent that people are other regarding and more heavily weight the payoffs of their co-partisans, then having more people like you in the group could potentially strengthen the instrumental benefit of answering correctly and thus decrease expression. And then finally, it could be that the value of expression depends on who hears it, in which case the benefit of giving a partisan response would change with the number of co-partisans. So we have these three different effects here. In the first case, the effect is driven by who is voting, which affects the likelihood of being pivotal. In the second case, it's driven by who stands to benefit, in which case it affects the instrumental benefit of answering correctly. And in the last case, it's driven by who learns the outcome, in which case it affects the benefit of expression. So we therefore designed an experiment to disentangle these three different potentially distinct effects. So how do we do this? So in many cases, it is potentially natural to think about two different levels of populations that matter in a voter's decision. So first, there are the voters themselves, the decision makers in the interaction. And second, there are the people who are affected. And this is potentially a broader group than just the people who are voting. So for instance, we could think of a faculty committee making decisions for an entire department or institution, or citizens voting on a referendum that would also affect non-citizens. Now we can think about varying the partisan composition of one of these groups while holding constant the composition of the other. And we could also turn on and off whether people learn the outcome of the vote. So first, we hold constant the voters and beneficiaries while varying whether the group learns the outcome of the vote, which allows us to assess the extent to which expression is performative. So we can assess how expression responds to the number of like-minded people who will hear it, while otherwise holding constant the players and the payoffs. Second, if we vary the proportion of Democrats and Republicans in the beneficiary group while holding constant the interacting agents in the game, the voters, we specifically test whether voters tone down their expression when more people of their own party are affected by the outcome. And then finally, if we vary the proportion of Democrats and Republicans who vote, then we can see how voters respond strategically to the composition of decision makers, while otherwise holding constant the people who will benefit and the people who will learn the outcome. So these are the questions that everyone saw in all of the conditions. So participants voted on the answers to 4 factual questions about politics, which were drawn from this larger menu of 8 questions, which includes the climate change question and immigration question that I showed you earlier. Each of these had 5 multiple choice answers. Now let's look at the conditions in the experiment. So participants are told that they're playing the game with 18 people and that the partisan composition of their group is either twice as many Republicans, the same number of Democrats and Republicans, or twice as many Democrats. So they are randomly assigned to one of these 3 conditions at the beginning, and then that's held constant throughout the experiment. Additionally, participants are randomly assigned to either the no voice condition or the voice condition. So in the no voice condition, they're told that their group members will never learn their votes. So at the end of the experiment, they just find out their total payments, and that's it, that's all they learn. In the voice condition, participants are told that after the votes are tallied, everyone's going to see the questions again, and they'll see the full distribution of votes for that question. So each person sees these 8 political questions, and only 9 of the 18 are selected to vote on each question. Then if the majority of the voters, so 5 or more people, answer correctly, all 18 members in the group get a cash prize. So we can hold constant the people who benefit while varying the voting composition for each question. So specifically, the number of Democrats voting is either 3, 4, 5, or 6. So notice that this 3 versus 6 is the most extreme distribution that we can have that works with all 3 of the total populations, since there's always at least 6 Democrats or 6 Republicans in the population. And then the way that we program this, each person is asked to vote on exactly 4 of the 8 questions, and each voter experiences exactly 1 of each of these 4 voting compositions across those 4 questions. So basically, this is what they see. So there's a timer at the top of the page. They are reminded about the composition of their group, which is held constant for the whole experiment. And then for the specific question, they find out whether they're voting and the number of Democrats and Republicans who are voting on that question. Then they see the question and multiple choice responses. If they're not chosen to vote on that question, they see all of the same stuff, but they can't select one of the multiple choice options. They just can hit continue and move on. So participants had 45 seconds to vote on the question, a little bit longer than in the other experiment because there's a bit more stuff on the screen here, and there was no feedback between questions. So the experiment was conducted on Amazon Mechanical Turk, and just as in the previous experiment, we first screened out anyone who did not identify as a Democrat or Republican or was not a US citizen or taking the survey outside of the US. And in order to participate, they had to correctly answer every single one of several comprehension check questions about the instructions. So this left us with almost 600 American political partisans who actually participated in the experiment. Okay, so now let's look at the results. So we're gonna focus on the partisan gap as our outcome variable here. And let's start by looking at how it changes with the number of co-partisans. So the horizontal axis here is the number of people in the full group of 18 who are members of the same party. So the partisan gap when the number of co-partisans is 6 here. This is the difference in the response of Democrats who know that they're in the minority and the responses of Republicans who know that they're in the minority, and so on. So overall, we see that the partisan gap weakly increases with the number of co-partisans. However, this is completely driven by whether or not their votes are shared with their group members. So in the no voice condition, we see that the gap is somewhat smaller when there are 12 co-partisans who will benefit. However, this is not significant at conventional levels here or in any of our specifications, so that there is at best weak evidence of other regarding this. People are not significantly more likely to refrain from expression when they know that the people that will be affected are like them. In the voice condition, we see the exact opposite pattern. The partisan gap increases significantly with the number of co-partisans. So people give more partisan responses when more like-minded people will hear it. We could also formalize these results in a regression framework by regressing individuals' response on our variables. So if we just regress on an indicator for Democrat, this gives us the raw partisan gap. It's almost identical to what we found in our previous experiment. Then in the subsequent models, to see the effect of a variable on the partisan gap, we look at the interaction of that variable with the indicator for Democrat. So let's include the indicators for voice, whether the voters are in the majority in the population and their interaction, as well as the interaction with Democrat to see the effect of the treatments on the partisan gap. So first off, we see that as before, without voice, the gap is not significantly different when in the majority. However, the gap is significantly greater when the voter is in the majority and in the voice condition. And then the last column simply includes demographic controls. The only demographic variables that seem to matter at all for response are education and race. So the gap is smaller among college-educated and non-white voters. But including the controls doesn't really have any effect on our main conclusions. Likewise, instead of an indicator for whether the voter is in the majority, we could include the number of co-partisans and we get almost identical results. So we conclude that voters are significantly more expressive when in the majority and their voice will be heard. We also find that voters are more expressive when they're in the majority among those voting. So not just in the total population, but among that voting group of 9 people. And this also is significant. So the partisan gap is greater when the voter is in the majority among those who are voting. So to summarize, we designed an experiment to tease apart the effects of partisan composition on expressive voting. We find only very weak, at best, evidence that voters become less partisan as there are more like-minded people in their group who could benefit from a correct answer. However, the overall number of co-partisans involved does have a strong effect when voters know that their voice will be heard. So voters become significantly more partisan as the number of like-minded individuals who learn their vote increases. Finally, we also find that voters respond to the composition of those voting and become significantly more partisan when they are in the majority.
Okay, Andrea.
21 seconds over.
Yeah, perfect. I mean, perfect timekeeping. Thanks a lot for this very nice talk. Are there any questions from the audience? And I guess you can unmute yourself if you have such a question.
I have a quick question. So when I saw the setup, I immediately thought of the swing voters curse, right? So where kind of moderate people try to outweigh the partisan voices in order to let then the informed guys to decide. And I mean, you're treating Republicans and Democrats here as kind of both extreme, but some of them might be very moderate. And so there could be moderates. I want to have the moderates decide, but I want to outweigh the partisans, and I maybe underestimate or overestimate. I overestimate the number of partisans on the other side. So even if I'm moderate, I change my opinion because I think I need to outweigh in a vote. I need to outweigh the other guys. While if it's individual decision, that's not necessary. Can you classify you guys into more moderates and more extreme partisans?
So we do have data on where they have to put themselves on the spectrum from most liberal to most conservative, but we have not looked at that yet. But that's a great idea. Yeah, if people who are more moderate are more likely to choose the correct answer in order to counterbalance.
And then might also be more subject to the bias.
They would be more subject to the bias?
Yeah. Because they want to outweigh the other partisans on the other side.
Gotcha. Okay. So, okay. I'll have to think about that. Yeah. Yeah. Thanks.
Are there any other questions? We still can take one. So then I ask a question, as is, I guess, my duty. And it's not a very particularly clever one, but so you just ask people how they locate themselves on the spectrum. So do we know anything about whether people answer correctly or not? I mean, on the internet, people, I don't know, like to change gender and all sorts of things. Is it maybe that people say, I'd like to play Republican today or something like this?
Yeah, so we ask them where they fall on the spectrum, but we also ask them whether they identify with a political party. So we primarily use that, and then we ask them which candidate they most supported in the primary, and we dismissed people who said that they most supported Trump even though they were a strong Democrat, or most supported Bernie Sanders even though they're a strong Republican. So we cut people out in that way, and then as far as whether people still could be playing a Republican or a Democrat with more consistency, that's completely possible, but we would expect that would cause the partisan gap to shrink. So it should work against our finding significant results here.
There's another thing, but I think that is maybe solved by the design in some way, and that is the question: how much can I guess from the payoff that I get in the end, right? So are you doing these 4 out of 8 so that people are not quite sure? Because you say you hold back the expressive element, but I can somehow deduce at least roughly whether we were right as a group or not and what the others did, right? So or is that because questions kind of flip and there's sometimes, do you know what my problem is? That
Sure, yeah, so we only tell them their final earnings so they can guess. I mean, they know with certainty, well, our group got these 3 questions right, but they have no idea which questions they got right, and they have no idea how many people answered correctly or what the correct answer was. So they get no feedback on any of those things. But necessarily they find out how many questions their group as a whole got right.
Okay, cool. Then I think we are, at least for the moment, done. I hope, I don't know whether it's custom that maybe at the very end we can, everybody who wants to can stay in the room and we can continue discussion. But I ask you, Andrea, to stop sharing your screen and Jara to come up on the stage.
Thank you.
And to unmute yourself.
There we go.
Perfect.
And are you guys in? There we go.
Yeah.
Let me, so you don't even have to worry about it. I too will set a timer over to the side.
Okay.
All right. So thank you all for coming, and for the people who just joined. You missed something really good. You should go back and read the draft. This is a paper with my co-author, Xiaofei Pan. It's moving support on up. It's a survey experiment. And I'm just going to jump right in. So we have this puzzle from the perspective of, say, like the Metzler and Richards model, where U.S. income inequality is going up rather dramatically since the 1970s. But support for redistribution, as you would expect from a model where median income is less than average income, support for redistribution has remained basically unchanged over 40, 45 years. And so the question is, well, why is that? And one possibility is that, at least in the United States, is that we systematically misperceive inequality. And there's a lot of documentation of this, Ariely and Norton in wealth inequality, and Gimbelson and Treisman in income inequality. And there's lots of other papers in social psychology that show Americans systematically believe there is less inequality than there is. But when you correct that in other survey experiments, it doesn't always result in more support for redistribution. So Kuziemko has this great paper in the United States where they throw lots of different pieces of information about inequality, where they allow people to answer questions and interact with the data, and they never really change their mind about anything, except in one case, which I'll talk about in a minute. And then Cruces et al. In South America and Karaja et al. In Northern Europe, they find some evidence of some correction, but not overall just all of a sudden people snap to the position that like the simple Metzler and Richards model suggests that they wouldn't. But perceived inequality is strongly, what people think inequality is really strongly tied to people's redistributive preferences. So there is an actual, like the link that we think should be there is there. It's just the perceptions don't seem to respond to the data. But another possible story is that it's not that people care about what inequality is now, but what they think is going to happen in the future, right? And this is the theory of the prospect of upward mobility, right? Someday we will all be millionaires. And this is linked to inequality concerns. So Day and Fisk in a social psychology paper find that people are much more likely to believe that the world is just and the distribution of income is sound if they believe in that there is more mobility compared to those who believe in less mobility. Similar findings by Sharif et al. And then actual experience of past mobility is tied to your support for redistribution today. So there's some evidence for this. There's just one tiny insignificant detail, which is that mobility has been declining in the United States, right? And less so around the world, but especially in the United States, there's been a real drop in both absolute and relative mobility. So what my co-author and I do is we do a survey experiment, again through Mechanical Turk, where we're going to look at the support for specific policies. So a lot of these papers choose to look at, especially for cross-country work, it's hard to have cross-country specific policies. So they choose like generic questions about, do you believe we should do more or less about redistribution? We use very specific policies. that we can find that some political entrepreneur has tied to the idea of mobility. And these policies have very different levels of genuine evidence linking them to mobility. And what we do is we have two treatments where we just ask people about their views of mobility, and then we provide them with the correct information. And then we're going to measure their change in belief about these mobility related policies. And again, when I say mobility related, I'm not claiming they're actually related, just that someone has related them. So we're going to show them about relative mobility, right? Where do kids from the 80s end up in about 2012 in the relative income distribution? Or where do kids in the 80s from different income groups, what fraction of them out earn their parents? Absolute mobility. And these treatments are most closely related to a paper by Alesina and co-authors in 2018, where it's really great cross-country data. They compare to they have several different measures of people's understanding of relative mobility, but then what they do is they prime people to believe that there's less mobility than there is, and then they look at how that affects views for redistribution. Spoiler alert, it does not. And so our two outcomes are, we have a measure pre and post the intervention of people's policy views on these 6 policies. So we're going to look at the change in policy views. And then the very last question of the survey is we allow people to write a letter to their US senators on whatever topic they so choose. And we code these letters for their content. So to put it up front, we do not find any effect of either the relative or absolute mobility treatments on support for any of the policies. But half of the arguments actually moved people in the direction of supporting that policy more. And in particular, cash assistance to the poor, housing vouchers, the Moving On Up program, and universal pre-K, right? And you'll see what an argument is. I'll show you that in a moment. And then the arguments affected content of letters, but they did not increase on the extensive margin. There are not more letters in any one treatment than the other, but it changes what the letters are about and the ratio of support versus opposition within those letters. So here's the experimental design. We're going to have, this is a survey experiment being run through MTurk. So we have a socioeconomic and demographic battery. Then we ask them for their initial views on these policies. Then they're going to be put either into a control or one of these 8 treatments. We're going to ask them again for their policy views. And then finally, we're going to give them the opportunity to write a letter to the US Senator, right? And they're getting paid a shade under $2 to do this. So writing anything to a US Senator is taking valuable time in an hourly wage sense from an MTurk worker. So I think you will be surprised at how much letter writing we in fact have. So we went and looked for policies linked to mobility, and we just started going, right, policy support economic mobility on Google, going to think tanks that are well known in Washington, D.C., and they didn't have to say mobility, but they had to say something about how this allows families to move up the income ladder. This allows families to get ahead relative to their current position over generations. Anything like that. And then, as you'll see, half of the policies kind of sort of make sense, right? The minimum wage, Brookings did a really nice review of the literature and said, it's not really well linked to intergenerational mobility, but certainly mobility within a generation, kind of. Cash assistance is better linked, especially in international evidence. We're all aware of Chetty's work on the Moving to Opportunity program. Universal pre-K is indirectly linked. There have been some findings out of Oklahoma that it does ultimately raise earnings for kids after high school. Others say we need to wait for more data. The marriage tax credit, I don't know how many people in here remember, but back in the late 90s and early aughts, there was a real push for the federal government to encourage 2-parent families because of the difference in economic outcomes for their children. And that kind of fell by the wayside and somewhere in the second Bush term, but there's a handful of people still out there that talk about that. So a marriage tax credit, right, to encourage 2-parent family formation. And then the last one, I don't see anyone else in the world pushing this, but all the anti-immigration groups in the United States, one of their constant arguments is, look, less supply raises wages, baby. That we should stop adding more workers to compete with your children. And they make it very explicit. So those are our 6 policies. And this is the dependent variable. This is what we're going to, oh, sorry. I meant to click on you guys to get you out of the way of my screen. So in experimental design, this is the question that we're going to ask pre and post intervention. And here's what the relative information treatment looks like. We ask them, imagine all of the children born to parents in the top 20%, and then we also do this for the bottom 20%. And we ask them, where do you think these kids born in the 80s end up today? This is a fairly common, this style of question has been used by a number of psychologists and economists and political scientists to understand people's mobility views. Some people find we overestimate mobility. Some people find we underestimate mobility. My co-author and I have a companion paper where we think that people are actually pretty decently accurate on this, actually, which we'll talk about towards the end. But you can see they answer this. We force them to add to 100, and we put the total right there on the screen so they don't get confused, because you can't have more than 100% of children. And then we immediately show them both graphically and numerically what the right answer is. So they answer, they click, they get the correct information. For the absolute, the only difference in the question is, for each of these income quintiles, what percentage of these children do you think out-earn their parents in real dollars? And then we don't, because there's no restriction, because they don't have to sum to 100, so people can answer things. There's no evidence that they try to make it sum to 100, because they never see the relative question, and B, their average sum is about 215%, right? Which makes sense because they're not percentages that add. And so our arguments, this is building off of Kuziemko et al. The one thing in their big experiment that moved people's views was they had a very short argument that was literally a picture of a mansion and a discussion of how few families end up paying the estate tax. And that moved people dramatically on the estate tax. And we said, well, this is an interesting thing. We're going to make these arguments, they're going to be not academic arguments. They're going to be like the Kuziemko et al. Argument. They're going to be an unabashedly for argument. And then we're going to take the best evidence that those proponents have and make it into a graph. So every argument was a 160-word argument and a graph. So that way all the arguments are standardized in the quantity of content, and also we want to give them their best shot at working. So like this is an example. This is the minimum wage argument. And again, this isn't what economists would say about the minimum wage. This is what people who argue that the minimum wage is good for intergenerational economic mobility would say about the minimum wage. So usually I just found an op-ed from someone in some think tank, and I boiled it down to 160 words. And then this is what the graph would look like. Right? And this is the graph that literally went with the op-ed that I boiled down. We just standardized it so they all had the same colors so that it wasn't anything about the visual presentation. And so the information and argument, right? We wanted to have a control situation that wasn't just asking people once. So what we did was we created placebo treatments. So Nickerson in a Get Out the Vote experiment looking at the social spillovers of voting uses a treatment where canvassers show up at the control households and tell them that recycling is important. So we used recycling as the placebo treatment. So in every single treatment, they get a piece of information, right, which is an interactive information task, an estimation task, and an argument. For the arguments, our actual 6 arguments, the information task asks them to estimate for 6 different recyclable goods what fraction is actually recycled according to the US EPA. And then they're told 55% of lead batteries and 37% of milk bottles are recycled. For the information treatments, they do either absolute or relative mobility. And then the argument is an argument about the importance of recycling. There are this many millions of tons of solid waste in the United States a year. You should recycle. That's it. So every single treatment, they answer the questions about those policies. They then either face, for the control, an interactive recycling activity plus plus a recycling argument, or recycling activity, one of our 6 arguments, or interactive information activity, recycling arguments. So that way, it's not about how much time they're spending on task or the type of task, because they're all doing the same type of task. We just changed the content. So this whole thing is in Qualtrics. We decided to go with non-masters qualified MTurk for the simple reason that masters qualified MTurk were highly likely to have been exposed to several survey experiments. Without going into details about the survey sample, our survey sample, as you can imagine, is younger, whiter, and more educated than the US population as a whole. But overall, and it is too Democratic and not Republican enough, but otherwise it matches on many substantive characteristics with the US population. And it's really similar to what a master's qualified population looks like, according to those that just pull sample from it to see what it looks like. And this was conducted back in April 2019, and we ended up with about 2,400 responses. We don't have, by the way, we have all the attrition that we ever had happened in the first 3 questions before we got to the experiment. So I can't even tell you about attrition by treatment because we didn't have anyone leave after they got that far. And all we're going to do is we're going to regress the change in policy views as a function of the treatment and covariates. And so here's what we get. Negative numbers. Negative numbers mean more support because I am dumb and I am the one who scaled it backwards. My co-author has asked me to fix it and she's in here and I will, I promise. And I should mention the stars on here, because we have 6 outcomes, we're correcting for multiple comparisons using it is not Bonferroni, but it is a Bonferroni-like correction that depends upon the correlation across answer categories. So if in fact they were completely uncorrelated, it would basically collapse to Bonferroni. In this case, they're all slightly correlated. So it's a little less severe than that. And you can see there's a little bit of a spillover where the minimum wage, right, the cash assistance argument very weakly increases support for the minimum wage. But in fact, if we go across, right, you can see cash assistance affects cash assistance, housing vouchers affects housing vouchers, universal pre-K affects universal pre-K, which is what you'd expect. You would not expect one of these arguments to have a strong spillover effect, and they don't. The other one is the relative and absolute information do not move anyone at all. And in some cases, in as much as there's any movement, it is in the wrong direction. They're not persuading anyone to support that policy in any way. So to clarify, information doesn't move anybody. Why? So one possibility is that our relative mobility views are surprisingly accurate on average. Compared to other findings, when we look at our mobility data and compare it to the real data from Chetty et al., our subjects are only off by a couple percentage points. They slightly overestimate persistence of the quintile you're born in, but after that, they do a pretty decent job. And then we've tried many different ways of looking at it. So are people who are more wrong, do they adjust their views more? No. The other possibility is that the information that they need, if you think about most of these models, is not the sociotropic, what is society doing, but where am I in this? And that's not the kind of treatment that we used. So that's something that's worthy of consideration. And then you can see the arguments do actually do what they're mostly supposed to do. But we like behavior, right? We're all economists. We like behavior. This policy thing is cute. But so the last thing we do is we ask them, would you like to write a letter to your senator? And this is the exact prompt we have with the exact size of the thing. And 921 of the 2,400 subjects wrote messages. Now, about a third of those were not real things. They were, thank you, neat survey. Some of them would literally copy and paste stuff and throw it in there like they were trying to get the right answer. But if you take those out and we take the remaining 640 some messages. The typical message was about as long as the argument that we gave them. So, right, about 175. Well, no, I'm sorry, it's 175 characters. I had 165 words. So it's like 2 sentences. Some of them were quite long. And we had 2 research assistants. My co-author had 2 research assistants at her institution code all the messages on whether or not what we call a real message, right? They weren't thank you, neat survey, that sort of thing. But additionally, did they talk about economic mobility at all? And then what policies did they mention? And did they mention them as a support or opposition, or they just mentioned the existence of the policy? And so here are examples of the messages, by the way. So the first one is an example of the kind of message. They have mentioned mobility. They have not said anything about what policies would be good for mobility. They mentioned mobility. You can see, right, I think legal immigration is good, but illegal immigration is very bad. So they want to reduce immigration. They only want to reduce one kind, but they want to reduce immigration. And then the last one just touches my heart. This is a person who's getting paid less than $2, and they wrote me part of an essay. Now, mind you, the whole essay is about state policies in Missouri, but they wrote an essay, right? So we've coded these messages. The assistants coded them. What we take is the average of the codes. I'm not going to show you the inter-rater reliability metrics on this, but the 2 of them working independently without seeing each other over the summer came up with incredibly similar codes to these. And again, simple regression of the message. It's a when I say binary, it's a binary, but it's the average. So in some cases it's 0.5, right? It takes on 3 values instead of 2 of whether they wrote the message, whether they wrote a real message, which is to say not one of those 230 some. And then we separately run, do you mention this policy? Do you mention it in favor? Do you mention it against? And as you can see, no effect on writing more messages. None whatsoever. There's no additional message writing. And right, so any written message is just, did you write anything, including the gobbledygook or messages to senator? Nothing. But it really moved the content, right? And you can see some spiller. There's a little bit, right? Relative to the control, relative mobility information made people less likely to write about immigration. But in general, messages led that, right? The arguments led people to write messages on that topic. And most of that led them to write messages supporting that topic, not opposing it. So I'll just go back, I'll toggle back and forth really quick. So like on the minimum wage, 11.3% more messages relative to the control, almost all of them in favor, right? Cash assistance, 9.1% more messages relative to the control, almost all of them in favor. So to wrap up, correcting misperceptions on information about relative or absolute mobility do not affect policy preferences, but that might be because they held accurate views on relative mobility. It can't be the story for absolute mobility because they had literally no idea. But again, looking at people who were more inaccurate, they don't move their policy views more than people who were more accurate. But arguments work, and this is consistent with Kuziemko et al. A very simple argument that presents one piece of data persuades people to write about a thing in this tiny environment. And it affects behavior, but it doesn't affect the quantity of behavior. It changes people who were already going to write. They write different things. And that's it. Thank you very much. Sorry, I went a little over.
Thank you. Are there any questions that want to be asked? If so, please unmute yourself and ask the question.
Jared, quick question for you on if you go back to your tables that you just had at the very end of your slide.
This one?
One more past that. Yeah, that one right there.
Okay, sure.
So my eyes go towards the one thing that looks different.
Yep.
And the idea that it looks like the housing voucher treatment led people to change and cash assistance as well.
Strike that. strike that and reverse it. Cash assistance has a spillover effect on housing vouchers. I'm sorry. Yeah.
So why do you think they're having some spillover into a unrelated policy there, but not in any of the other treatments?
So that's a good question. Well, there's also a spillover if you I had this problem too. I had my Brady Bunch view over my less immigration column, but if you look at the minimum wage, there's a negative spillover onto immigration as well. So I went and looked at those messages because at first I thought, oh, maybe it's just a coding thing. Like maybe people are regular people do not speak as precisely as think tanks or academics. So I went and looked at the messages and no, they really do bring those things up. And so possibilities are once you're more likely to write about mobility, you write about the thing, right? You write about the thing that we argued for, but you also, if you're thinking more about mobility, anything else that you are favorable towards, you write about. Now I've tried putting in the pre-treatment views there to see if that also helps explain, and that does not seem to be what's going on. So in general, there are a handful of spillovers, and they don't seem to be easily explained by pre-treatment views or any of the other covariates. And I don't really see the link between cash assistance and housing vouchers, except it's two things that we commonly bundle together as welfare in the United States. But they're separable programs. So no, that spillover is not easily waved away.
Jared, can I ask you a question?
Oh, please.
Yes. Quick.
Yeah, you are interpreting these results as behavior, basically as a behavior change. But basically, what you're doing is you're giving them some piece of information, and you ask them to write something. And it could be kind of an experimental demand effect that they think, okay, now I should write about what you just told me. Is it really behavior? I mean, is it really that you change anything there, or I don't know. I mean, I see it as an experimental demand effect, right? So.
So for an experimental demand effect, I mean, first, 2/3 of them aren't writing a letter at all, right? And then once we throw out the thank you, this was a cool survey, I really liked knowing how many batteries there were. After that, you're down to about a quarter. And then of that quarter, there are some people who respond to this and others that do not respond to it, right? It doesn't result in everyone writing about it. A number of people write messages, but they write generic messages. 11% more messages in the minimum wage treatment mention the minimum wage, but the base rate of mentioning it isn't 0 in the control group either. So we've heard, right? I hear you. That is, other people have said that to us. I do not agree. I don't know how else to say it. I do not agree. They had the opportunity to skip a behavior, right? An action that they did not have to be paid for, and they chose to write something. That's behavior. It's not a very exciting behavior. It's not a world-changing behavior, but it's a behavior of voters.
No.
Okay. On that note, I think we have to continue. And there's one more question I'm going to ask, but you're not going to answer it, so that people have an incentive to stay on at the end. And that is, did you really send all those messages to the senators? Right? So we keep that secret until the end, and anyone who wants to stay on at the very end can stay on, and we will talk about it. Can you stop sharing your screen, Jared?
Done.
Perfect. Then I've got to, there we are. Yeah, so I'm last in the session, and I'm a bit embarrassed. I haven't done anything on Amazon Turk, and neither have my co-authors, at least not in this project, but maybe there's another thing that is going to come in these new times. So what you see here is 2 types of chocolate. So for the non-German speakers, this here is milk chocolate, and this is dark chocolate, as you may already guess by the cover. And this is just kind of one fun example to lead you through a little bit which is related to our experiment. So suppose you've got the choice between these two different types of chocolate, and you have to decide for a whole group. So you have to vote, right? You're voting to find out, are we going together to buy this chocolate or that? And everybody will get one, right? So this is kind of a little bit, I guess, where a lot of voting then ends. There's going to be a result and it's going to be implemented. But this is of course not true in reality, because in reality, things are then put in law or something else, and we're not sure just because it's in law it's actually going to happen, right? So there's some implementing phase, and essentially two reasons why the majority for a certain policy does not ensure its implementation. So one, there's discretion in bureaucracies, right? So there may be people who are maybe bureaucrats who are partisan and who don't want that, and who use their space to prevent things from happening. And then there are some things which are kind of outside something. We can, for example, as a society, decide that we want to protect a certain species, rhinoceroses or whatever, and then somebody goes and shoots them, right? And we don't know who this was, right? They have just used this space that's not observed by society, right? Now, you could kind of fill this implementation gap by massive coercion, right? So this is what a Chinese friend of me calls kind of the Chinese solution, is you monitor everything, and then you make sure is absolutely not going to happen. Nobody's going to shoot rhinoceroses, and no bureaucrat ever has any chance to do anything other than what's in the interest of the electorate. So we don't really want that. So and we cannot also not afford it, right? It would be really expensive in many ways. So the question then is, well, should we maybe trust these people to conform? And yeah, I don't know what the reduced power bit comes later. I've forgotten why it's here. I'm surprised by now. Okay. So if it's about the bureaucrat, then you may think, okay, I bring in other bureaucrats of my shade, right? Partisan of my type, and then we kind of represent in the bureaucrats the view of the public, right? So if there are kind of 90% of bureaucrats who don't want to allow a certain thing, or people who don't want to allow this, we bring in 90% of bureaucrats and then kind of curb the power of this bureaucrat. So that's something you can think of. Or if you think about the other thing, you could kind of reduce the power to shoot rhinoceroses by preventing people to get the respective weapons. You don't allow these weapons anymore, right? That will make it harder for people, probably still possible to shoot these animals, but it will make it harder for them. But they may react to that, right? Both. The bureaucrat may say, well, why don't you just trust me? I would not have imposed this other law. And the people who suddenly cannot get these weapons anymore say, well, now I'm going to get a weapon, right? I'm going to use this kind of gap. So there's this question, like, do I trust these people, either the people in the general public or the bureaucrat to conform, or do I try to control this and curb this behavior in some way, right? So that's something that will come up later as a treatment effect in our experiment that we're interested in. More generally, we're interested in this question, like, how can we get minorities to conform? And for that, we have to kind of learn, why do they conform? And when do they conform, under which circumstances? So that's what we are interested in. And by conform, we mean voluntary conforming. And that is, we don't want any enforcement here, right? Because we don't want to, we want to use that a little bit. And that's a very important thing, right? If your people conform, if they wear masks in a situation where this is the right thing to do, and you don't have to put a policeman next to every person, that's a helpful thing. So why may people conform? Well, one thing they may conform is, like, I say, okay, this time, say, since we were in this like Republican Democrat frame all the time, like this time it's the Republicans' turn, but it will be my turn in the future. And so I'm now playing along with the game because I later want people to play along with the game as well. But that, of course, is uncertain, right? Your gift may never be returned. Yeah. So I don't know whether there will still be a Republican Party in 4 years. But even if there is, it's not clear that they will get back into power and that they will do something, right? So this motive we are not interested in, and we will rule it out in our design. There's a second motive, which is social image concerns, right? I do it because other people see me. I'm not going to shoot the rhinos because I know the majority is against shooting rhinoceroses, and that's why I don't do it, right? So it's kind of social pressure argument. But then there are situations where nobody's watching you, right? Especially when you're out there with your gun to shoot the rhinoceros. There's not many people around that you can impress by not shooting them, right? So you shoot them. So that's again something that that we're not so interested in because there are many situations where no witnesses, and that's also going to be ruled out in our design. Now the next point is social learning, right? So I may not know whether it's actually good to shoot rhinoceroses or not. So I see what other people have done in the vote, and because I'm an unclear person, I'm learning how the right thing is not to shoot rhinoceroses, and then I stop shooting rhinoceroses. This is, of course, possible, but it requires a joint objective. So we need to have I must believe that everybody who voted there has the same interest as I have. If I have different interests than them, then I cannot learn from them, right? So, so that's a possibility, but it has this thing. So we cannot really rely on this to work in many contexts where people have these opposing interests. And it's going to be not fully ruled out in our experiment design later. So the force we were really interested in is I care. Yeah. So I am the guy who likes the milk chocolate, and I actually do. Many people around me don't anymore, right? And now there's this vote coming up, and I can later buy the chocolate, and although nobody's going to see me, I'm going to buy the dark chocolate because the majority wants it, and I care about them, and I don't want to destroy it for them, right? So that's what we call caring conformists, and that's kind of the motive we are after, and we want to see whether it's just an imagination or whether it's actually there in a very particular setup, not even nearly as close to real populations as the previous two talks on Amazon Turk. So we've got a couple of questions. We have the question is like, do people conform voluntarily in our relatively aseptic setting where there's actually no viewing, all these stuff is going to be taken out, except maybe a little bit of social learning. So do we see that? That's the first question that we need to answer. Second question that we want to answer is, do people conform just because they care, out of like a civic duty that I'm now in a situation, I'm this bureaucrat, I can do it, but I'm not going to do it because I don't want to run against the will of the majority. I see it as my duty to fulfill what the majority wants here, although I am of a different opinion. So that's this question. We want to see whether this is there in our data. And then if yes, we want to see whether this can be moved. Whether these people, if you curb their power, maybe they have this attitude that they say, okay, you've curbed my power. Now I'm going for it because now everybody has a chance here, and I'm going to use my little power that I have. Or so whether they actually conform less if you curb their power, right? So that's the question. And that phrase you can reformulate, because it's essentially a question about whether you act more responsibility if you have more power. And that is kind of old stuff. This can be traced back to the French National Assembly, like the very first, like sometime in the 18th century, where they said, yeah, if you give people this power, then if you give the people the power, they will act responsibly. But you also find it under the title of Peter Parker principle in Spider-Man, right? And Churchill said it, and so on. There's like, I guess there's almost no person who hasn't said this, right? That if you give power to the people. What's interesting about this is, although it's kind of everywhere from trivial to politics, it's not really predicted by most of the theories that we have, right? So it's a very intuitive principle, but especially certainly all theories which are dealing with outcomes would not predict there to be any change in this, and you will later see in the experiment maybe more clearly what I mean by that. Okay, so that's kind of the plan. And here's the design, like really like snapshot, 20-minute snapshot of the design. We've got 7 different domains on which we ask people to make a choice. They get 2 lotteries. So 4 lotteries in total. They can decide between the first 2 lotteries, between the second 2 lotteries. They get 2 allocation tasks where 2 people get a lot and 1 doesn't get anything. They get the chocolates that you've just seen. They get art postcards, and then they get a true, what in my sense is a pure social learning situation. They get a jar and they have to estimate whether there's more than a certain amount of coins in there or less, and that's the choices they can make. Of these domains, we're going to select 3 for payout in the very end, and they're actually going to get that stuff, right? So if it's the art postcard, it's the art postcard. It left us with lots of chocolates and art postcards because we had to have them in the lab. So let's look at one of these domains, and they were all structured the same. Say my milk versus dark chocolate example. We had several decisions that people made. They made this decision several times. First, they made a decision just for themselves so that we know what they actually like. So to see, then in this decision, you would find out, for myself, I choose milk chocolate because I prefer milk chocolate. Then they had to vote, and this vote was kind of determining the policy for all. So if the majority was milk chocolate, everybody got milk chocolate. If the majority was dark chocolate, everybody got dark chocolate. Then came this implementation phase where people can actually put this into practice, the bureaucrat who can decide for everyone, or the guy outside with a gun who can do something. And it's a decision that's going to affect everyone, but on your own. And it comes in 2 different shapes that are our 2 treatments. In one case, they could just veto, and this would be a veto, the decision that has just been made. So if the majority has decided for dark chocolate, I don't like dark chocolate, I go for milk chocolate, which is akin to shooting the rhino, because if it's dead, it's dead. You cannot do anything about it. Yeah, and if you haven't seen it, it was at night, it's gone, right? I can kind of destroy the policy. Or every one of the 3, and there are always 3 who make this decision here, so a very small electorate, every one of the 3 gets a 1/3 chance to do their thing, which is where their power is curbed. So if I can choose the rhino, I have absolute power. Nobody's going to see me. I'm going to do it. But in the other case, I'm kind of limited. I don't have access to weapons. Maybe I get it, maybe not. Maybe you have the weapon, I don't. So there's kind of this limit in there, and that's going to be our treatment. So the veto treatment is where I've got a lot of power as a bureaucrat, and as a random dictator with probability 1/3, I have very little power. After that, we form a new group of 3, and then in this new group, we vote again, and we make this bureaucratic decision again. And sometimes we call these rounds. So this first decision is the first round, and the second round is vote plus decision, and the third round is vote plus decision. And then one of these rounds is selected for payout in this domain. So now, why do we do this repeated thing here at the end? Well, the reason is that we want to identify people who care. So if I care, what I will do is I will, here in this decision, vote for milk chocolate. Then maybe the majority decides for, in the vote I will do that. I will vote for my milk chocolate. The majority decides maybe for dark chocolate. Then I may say, okay, so in this group, most of the people like dark chocolate. I yield. I don't like it, but you want it, you can have it. But in a new group, I will vote again for milk chocolate, where someone who learns will stick to the, so if I'm the type who kind of, I don't know, what's good chocolate, milk chocolate, dark chocolate, I don't know, and you all vote for dark chocolate and I become the dark chocolate guy, I will stay the dark chocolate guy, and in the next round, next vote, I will remain a dark chocolate guy. So that helps us separating later the people who learn from the people who are going to yield temporarily, but actually quite steadfast in what they want to achieve, and see whether this is really caring, conformism, or learning. Okay, so that's the design. Stupidly, I forgot to note myself how much time I have, and I didn't ask anybody else to do that. So I guess I still have kind of around about 6 or 7 minutes, and that's what I'm trying to. Okay, cool. Yeah, it gives me the thumb up. So let's move to the results. If I can. Yeah. So here's the first question, which is, do people actually conform in our aseptic setting? And what we do is we could just look at how many change their behavior after seeing the vote, right? And you see, like, yes, some people, even when in the majority, they change their behavior, but a lot more in the minority do. So that's conformism, some crude form of conformism that we have here. So they decide differently after voting, and more often so in a minority. And you can run a regression, and then you find that this is highly significant and even control for some more things than I say here. Okay, so that's kind of the first thing. Now it comes to the more exciting point, and it maybe also the more tricky one. So we want to see whether people are actually these caring conformists. And for that, we use two decisions that we have where no new information arrives. The first decision where no new information arrives is between your individual decision and the vote. Because I decided for milk chocolate, now we're going to vote, I'm going to vote milk chocolate. There's nothing new I learn at this point, right? And then there's a second decision where, again, no new information arrives, and that's between my decision as a veto or dictator and the second vote, and also no new information arrives, right? So we observe that at the first decision, 11 or roughly 12% change their behavior. So they're not all constant, right? So maybe these people are indeterminate, they just confuse people or whatever. So they change even though no new information arrives, right? And we need this as a benchmark because we want to know how many people do that normally. So if you look at the people who did not conform, you find before the second vote, also roughly 12% change their behavior. So this seems to be this gives us this benchmark against which we can then check and look, and how about the people who had a conforming history? So I have just yielded. Am I now more likely to, like you would now expect, that's also 12%, but the percentage is actually much higher. It's in the 60s that we get here, right? So which is an indication that that actually there are people who change back to their original behavior, which is what this means here. And this is more likely to happen, and you can test these against these, than in the case when you have never conformed, or in your very first question where there was no question about conforming or not. Now, this number is actually not entirely correct because there are many effects here. There can be selection effects, which is a bit annoying for an experiment, but they can be. And maybe we should have dealt with it in some clever way, but I didn't realize at the time. So I guess initially we were not doing the statistical tests. We were just happy to be able to identify this type. And when we started testing against other things, this came up. But there's a little bit that we can do about this using econometrics, and this is what we do. We look at several things. So these numbers here now are results of a regression. We look at everyone who's changing behavior just before the second vote, where there's no reason to do that. That's 16%. And we decompose that effect with a regression. And we find out that 10% of it goes to people who would do that anyway, who would have done that also in the very first question. Yeah. Then because we're in a second question, we allow for an effect for the second question, which is 2% here, which is significant. And look at the people who are not conforming. So this is kind of the dummy for the non-conforming people. There's 10% of them already changed in the first question, 2% more changed in the second question. And then we see that those with a conforming history, even in the first question, are more likely. So they are a bit more fluctuant people. They are a bit like, so this is going after the selection effect. There are people who already in the very first question are more likely to change. So we cannot contribute the whole difference that we had before to this, because some of this is kind of naturally already there. But the remainder here is the interaction term, and that's what we can actually contribute to this caring conformists. And so we can, and it is a significant number. So we can answer this question, I think, with yes, that we do have these caring conformists in our sample, and they're very likely to explain behavior. Okay, last slide, or one but last slide, is we look at our treatment effect. we look at all people who are steadfast in the sense that whenever they vote, they decide for the same. So milk chocolate, or dark chocolate, dark chocolate. And we look at those then who are in the minority of this group. And then we look at those who in between went and yielded to the others. And we look at how many yielded of this group, how many yielded in between in the two treatments. And we find that in the random dictator treatment, where I have very little power, very little people yield. Whereas in the veto treatment, where I have a lot of power, a lot of people yield. So we find the Parker principle here. Although anything that has to do with outcomes, the outcomes are going to be the same. If I care about the outcomes of these people, it should be that I should behave exactly the same as here. But somehow the fact that my power has been curbed is changing my behavior, and I'm much less likely to give in to your dark chocolate here than I am in this veto treatment. There I'm much more yielding. So that's interesting. What's also interesting is that the social learning is not affected at all. So if you did yield because you're a social learner, you changed behavior because you're a social learner, the treatment has no effect. This share stays the same. Okay. So to summarize, we do find that people conform voluntarily, and we find that about 30% conform not because they learn something, but because they care about others here. And those can be changed. This share can be changed and affected by how much power you give these people. And if you give them a lot of power, if they know they have a lot of power, they're much less likely to change something, although they shouldn't. If you take Fair-Schmidt preferences or something like this, anything outcome related, it shouldn't change behavior. Yes, that was me. And if you have any questions, shout. And maybe, Jared, you can say something about time. Do we still have time for questions? Very minuscule. Yeah. Okay, one question maybe, and then you're all free, and everybody who wants can stay, and we will all three maybe stay in this room and continue to discuss if you're happy with that. Oh, I've killed everyone, it seems.
No.
And there's no chair to ask questions now, right? I can ask myself questions. Okay. If there are no questions, then I officially close the session. It was nice having you all here. And yeah, I wish you a nice continuation of the conference, and hope to see you at some point again, maybe even in real life.
When that's a thing again.
When that's a thing again. Yeah. Okay. So there was one question that I want to know from you, Jared, and that was the question: did you really send these even the strange ones?
So here's what we did. I wrote a very short email, like a paragraph email. Dear Senator, I'm a researcher at California State University, Channel Islands. These are messages from people who claim to be your constituents on Mechanical Turk on this topic, generated through a survey experiment. And so here's the thing. I used to work in DC. And if you ever, so like Andrea's in Vermont, if she tried to send a nice email to the senators in Massachusetts, like 3 or 4 weeks later, she would get a very nice note back saying, I'm so sorry, but your senators are these other people. So I got 49 times 2 of those. As I said, and I mean, I would say like, this is not from me. I'm in California. I know I'm in California. As I just, but I like, and you can imagine, I mean, I had friends who worked, they're called,
so they write to the wrong senators.
No. No. It's not that they wrote. I mean, they just wrote their message. But I had because I don't have the name, address, phone number, anything of the participants. So I'm sending them. But apparently, because I have to fill out this little form to send them, all they see is I'm from California, and the legislative correspondent, the 23-year-old who works in the Senate office, goes, oh yeah, this moron's in the wrong state. Here, let me tell him that he's from California. And I'm like, I know I'm from California. I'm giving this to you. It's a thing. I said I would do it. Here's why. But yeah, I sent him in. I mean, that level of correspondence usually doesn't do very much. Actually, a number of what I'll call the no content messages, like they didn't address any topic. One of the most common things that they wrote when they clearly wrote a sentence is, I don't believe senators listen to constituents.
Okay.
That was like 2 or 3. I mean, again, most of them were thank you. But anyone who wrote a real sentence, but it didn't have any of that content, the most common one was, I don't believe this.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Do you think, by the way, I didn't want to bug you, but do you think that the type of thing that they were choosing in the experiment might affect the degree of conformity? Because I could see some things where it's like you were saying with the chocolate, like I like milk, you like dark.
Right.
That's right. In that case, I might conform a lot less. I mean, I might be hesitant to use my power, but I wouldn't change my vote the second round because I'm hoping I'll get at least one other person who likes milk, and then I get my way. But unlike the art postcards, I did actually learn a little bit, like, oh yeah, I don't want these, but someone will want these. And it's good to know what other people want, because it's not
right.
like it's
Exactly. So there is, so that's why they're a bit structured. And I guess the more you get into real life of our domains, I mean, if I go back, so I should have stopped sharing.
Oh no.
The more you get into real life here, so there's little to learn from the lotteries, right? Because that should be your personal risk aversion that's governing your choice, and little to learn from the allocation, because it's absolutely spelled out. You know how much you get and the others get. Chocolate, there's a little bit more to learn. Art, there's more to learn because you can pass on these to others. And then there's most to learn with this jar, right? Yeah. So I agree with you that there are slightly different questions, and people may care more about them or less about them as well. So when we run the regressions, we put in dummies to take account of that. But
nothing.
You're absolutely right. It's not. There is a dimension. I mean, I initially thought no, but then if you think about it, yes, you can learn something, or you can at least believe. It's enough that people believe that they can learn from the other something, right? So and that's a problem, right? Even a postcard, even if you keep it for yourself, you may think, if other like it, maybe I want to have it to put it in my whatever kitchen, and then people say, oh, you have this nice postcard and so on, that you don't really like it, but others like it, right?
By the way, I apologize. My spouse needs to get to work, so I need to bounce and go watch children. You all have a great day, and I'll ping you guys later by email. Take care.
Yep. Bye, Jared.
Bye.
So that gives me the chance to ask you, Andrea, something, which is beyond the project. That's also why I didn't ask it, but maybe not entirely, because it has to do with this expressive voting in terms of. So it seems like in your case, it's really about allegiance or something like this. Yeah. Would you say that's a fair comment, that these people do it because they want to show to the others, yes, we're one gang, and we know how the world is. It's terrible for us, or?
So I don't think that we can necessarily say exactly what the mechanism is.
Right, but it's a potential one, right?
Right. So we know that when people know that there are more people like them that can hear them, then they are more loudly expressive. And it's kind of remarkable. There's also a big effect when you know that you're in the minority and people will hear you. You really tone down your expression and kind of sink back into the shadows here.
Right.
So it seems that the value of giving this partisan expression increases when you know that more people like you will hear it, but we can't say exactly
right. But I mean, this is one candidate, and you probably know more candidates. I mean, one candidate would be to say this has to do with me trying to, maybe even conform, right? I try to please, I want to be with the others, and I want to say I'm one of you, I'm not one of this, and this is a way to signal this. That would be interesting, right? If you can kind of, because do people know what I said initially on this first question, whether I was considering myself a Democrat or a Republican.
Yeah, so they know the composition of their group, so that's based on how they answered that question.
Right. Okay. So, and it's interesting because what I just said is maybe not true. My channel, because my channel is, or it's a misperception. My channel is, I want you to know that I'm, I don't know, Republican, right? So I am saying something very Republican so that you know, but you don't know even who I am. You just know the number of votes in the end, right?
Right, and you already know the partisan composition of your group, so they don't
Right,
need to
but
signal that through their vote, but they might want to sort of perform for an audience of people that they know to be like them. And once they know that there are other people like them, then they need to act more to conform with that view.
Right, because I thought it was something like I don't know, introspection, right? When I'm in a situation like this, sometimes I may say something like this just to show to other people I'm on your side, right? Because it's a bit ridiculous to get up and say, yes, I am, but it's more intelligent to say, yeah, I also think there's a problem with whatever, and that's a way to express this. But since people have no image concerns, nobody knows who this is really funny, right? So that channel cannot be the channel. That's interesting. Because if so, then, I mean, something you could vary in future experiments is you could also say whether this vote came from someone who identified Republican or not, right? Because then I don't have this channel. This is a way to shut down this channel. If you say, okay, this is a Democrat saying this, then you already know I'm a Democrat. You don't need to listen to my vote to know who I am, right? But it's interesting. It's really interesting. So looking into this channel, I find intriguing. Also intriguing because I think I'm interested in the more general question whether how, I mean, I don't know. I know I'm in Germany here. I shouldn't bother, but I'm giving me kind of the US shoot like almost every day and looking at the New York Times headlines, right? And I also followed the impeachment trial. And I found it absurd, absolutely absurd. I don't know, maybe my perspective, that there are two people from different sides who can be so, and this seems to be a little bit your theme, so disagreeing on the facts, yeah, on the simple facts like what constitutes corruption, what is expressed in this transcript of the telephone call and so on. You see like adults who are completely falling along the lines, completely down, right? And so on. What I think is interesting is, well, they kind of have to, right? So there's this, there you do identify. You cannot say anything, or it takes a lot of courage in a situation like this to stand up and say, I'm sorry, right? This is not true, right? I don't see how this, even if you ask it as a question, right? So I wonder, and this could be treatment or an experiment in some sense. I wonder whether when you do that in private, so you match Republicans and Democrats in private, just two of them, and you don't let them vote, but they should kind of jointly agree. They have to come to consensus because they're just two on something. What happens then, right? And maybe this is good for democracy because then people don't have to openly show this, right? So I, as a Republican, as many Republicans did, right, privately admitted certain things that they were not willing to say public, right? In some sense, and that could be in. I know it's not really about voting, it's not really about expressive voting, but it's a little bit about this, okay, can we engage in a conversation on a one-by-one level that can help society to converge in some Bayesian sense of beliefs also, so that we can make joint decisions again, right? And not have to kind of cut down the middle. I don't know. Was more like a mission. I try to convince you that this.
Yeah, no, that's an interesting point. If people have to sort of negotiate one-on-one what answer they're going to come up with.
And I wonder what the result may be in that setting, because it does take the public away, right? The only public is then the two of us and Danielle, who's still listening and bored by now. But
he's not listening.
Yeah, I don't know. Would be interesting. So if you ever hear about an experiment like this, or even want to do it, I think I would be game. Something in this range, like, because it's about bringing people together again. It's something that the US, I think, needs at this moment anyway. And if you have any sort of designs and ideas of engaging in this would be a good thing. Yeah.
Yeah. So the next thing that we're thinking about doing is adding more information, actually. So in our previous experiment, we saw that giving people access to unbiased information that they knew contained the right answer tended to bring the partisan gaps down, and people were more likely to answer correctly.
Right.
And our next step is, well, what happens when people can actually choose their source of information? And if they prefer to consume more biased information, then this
right.
increase the gap even further.
Right.
So that's our next step.
Which we probably all do, but which is totally not what is predicted in theory, right? Because theory would say you should go to the other side to learn something if it's factual information, right? Because you already know what you know, right? You wouldn't go for your I mean, that's correct, right? You would go for
so I mean, it depends on the extent that you find it psychologically costly to have to read
right. So what gets you out of this is psychological costs, right? But if you want to make an informed decision, then you should go for the bias against you. Right. By the way, something that maybe is in the presentation of your in the way you present things that struck me a little bit is that I really like the Brexit example, but then it didn't really click with the rest, right? Because in the rest, the bias is always, I don't know. So in this Brexit example, I think the people are going against it because they want to, they think they're not affecting the result, and they want to send a message. Be scared. David Cameron, be scared. And that's not part of what happens later. And that could be misleading, right? In some sense. Although it's a really cool example about this, we don't see that later in your data because it's not about that. These people always, there's nobody who's saying something else because they want to show something to someone.
Right. Yeah. So I mean, it was just supposed to be an example of the idea of voter expression in general. Doesn't necessarily tie in with the partisan composition aspect because Brexit voters didn't have information that they were going to be in the majority in advance. But it was just supposed to be an example of a situation where people may vote for something that they don't actually believe, and if they do wind up being in the majority, then this has this consequence that affects everyone and leads to a worst case scenario for the people that voted against it, plus the people that were being expressive.
Right. Yeah, I don't know. Maybe it's there's a problem.
Definitely doesn't map perfectly onto this experiment, though.
Yeah, and that's of course there's a danger that you then disappoint referees or people who see that later, right? Mm-hmm. And also I'd like to see this. I'd like to see the Brexit paper as well, right? I'd like to see people who for some reason are angry, want to express this, and do then this expressive voting. At least that's what I somehow expected, right? When I heard this example, I thought, okay, we're going to see people who are actually going against their own thing because they want to push an agenda somewhere or want to say like, no, I mean, maybe these people wanted to, or maybe just wanted to be heard, right? They wanted to say like, you can't go on like this. I mean, I respect you in principle and I'm on your side, but you cannot go on like this. And this is what they wanted to say actually, right? And that would be also interesting to identify whether such preferences are actually there, because we have anecdotal evidence from the cases you gave, but we don't really know whether people do that in real life. I think we don't know. Or
yeah, I mean, so we do have the evidence that people vote differently. They vote for things that they don't necessarily believe, and wouldn't vote for if they knew that they were going to be decisive. So in that sense, we have that evidence.
So there are experiments of this type. This was the last.
So this was the first experiment that we did,
that you did.
which was published a couple years ago. Yeah.
Okay.